The long national nightmare is over. Calen Addison has signed for the 2023-2024 season. So what's next for Calen Addison? We'll look at that, plus the Minnesota Wild roster set for training camp. And what does this mean for the Wild's ability to add during the season? All that and more on today's episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any of our new episodes throughout the course of the week. Today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jase case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com. That's J-A-S-E medical.com. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we recap the Calen Addison signing and what comes next for the young Wild defenseman. We'll also talk about the 2023-2024 roster being officially set, and we'll look at the very tight budget that the Minnesota Wild have for the upcoming season. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and as we discussed, it's over. The long national nightmare has finally ended, and Calen Addison has signed for the upcoming season. A one-year deal for Addison worth $825,000. The big thing that I'll point out with this deal is that Addison becomes a restricted free agent after the season is over. More on that in a little bit, but just a couple of stats to put your way. Addison recorded 29 points, 3 goals, and 26 assists in 62 games played during his rookie season in 2022-2023. His 26 assists sets a new single-season franchise record among rookies. He also led all NHL rookies with 18 power play points last season. And for all the success that Addison had on the power play last year, there was a lot made about his defense as the season wore on, and it led to Addison being more often than not a healthy scratch as the season wore on, as we got to the stretch run. Obviously, the Wild brought John Klingberg in to assist in the final few games before the postseason started. We all know how that worked out. And so it is interesting to me that the two players that got the hype videos before the season started, Marco Rossi and Calen Addison, ended up having interesting seasons, to say the least. But Addison now in the fold, and he will be able to help the Wild, especially on the power play, because, look, the power play was a completely different animal with Addison in that defenseman spot, kind of running things from the top. Just had a great eye and knack for knowing where the puck needed to go. It just looked completely different with others in that spot. It just was not as successful. It was entirely more perimeter based. And a lot of that, I think, stemmed from the decision making at the top, where Addison was able to be a little more aggressive because he saw the ice a little better than some of those other guys. It led to a ton of goals and points for that power play unit, especially early on in the season. And so getting him back on that unit is going to be critical for the Wild special team success throughout the course of the season. The area that I think everybody wants to see improvement in, and this is because this is the one that was made the biggest deal of, is on the defensive side. And we know that Addison's forte is not being a defensive defenseman. He is definitely more offense oriented. But Bill Guerin and Dean Evison said it after the season was done, and it has been reiterated as we get close to the start of this season, is that Addison just needs to work on being more consistent on that end of the ice. It's great that he is contributing on a special teams basis, but more consistency, I think, is what both Guerin and Evison are looking for coming into this season. And Dean Evison said as much in his chat with Michael Russo. That's the thing that they want to see from Addison is to just compete every time out there on the defensive side. And you're not going to be perfect. You're going to get beat in particular instances and particular occasions throughout the year. And that's all fine. That's all well and good. But I just don't want to see a repeat of what happened last year, where Addison seemed to be the one that took the brunt of the punishment for the third line in general, making mistakes, committing penalties, being out of position, because that's not all on him. There were other players on that line, and we can deduce who that was. There were other players on that line that made plenty of mistakes, but they were not held to the same level of punishment as Addison was this past season. And so, yes, improvement on the defensive end is important for Calen Addison, but he brings a ton to the special team side and to the offensive side too. So let's just see some improvement this year, but not also tally up mistakes and punish accordingly depending on the severity of said mistakes. This does bring up an interesting kind of scenario for Addison and for the Wild, being that Calen is a restricted free agent after the season is done. Obviously, the Wild want to see some improvement from Addison, some continued growth from Addison, because let's not forget, too, he is still a very young player at the NHL level, and it takes a little while for players to get accustomed and comfortable to playing the NHL game. And so it's not as though this is who he is. There's still plenty of time for growth and improvement. And so the hope is that we see more of that growth this season, that there was some work put in the off season. And look, Addison has mentioned it as well, is that he knows what he needs to do uh, this season to improve. And so now it's just about doing it, just about getting on the ice and doing it, and just letting everything kind of take care of itself as the season plays out. But as far as that restricted free agent status goes, do not be surprised, depending on how much money is available for the Wild in the offseason. Don't be surprised in the slightest if we see things take a similar path to what happened with Brandon Duhaime, where he was able to agree to a deal before going to arbitration, but just a 1-year deal because money's still tight, and anything that the Wild can just kind of get through next year with players that they want to keep, if you can just get it by until there's more money available, that's the route that they're going to go. And so um, I think if Addison has a another good season on special teams, and if we see some good things defensively, and if we see all that, it's not going to shock me at all if the Wild look to re-sign him long term after this season is done. But it may be that the long-term extension comes after next season as opposed to after this season. So a lot to digest and a lot to consider with Calen Addison. It's going to be very interesting to see how things play out, because you've got a lot of the same roster, and so the hope is that we don't see a lot of the same mistakes by this team as we go. So now that Addison is signed, what does that mean for the rest of the roster? Well, we're pretty set, and so we'll talk about that as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Jace Medical. With storms, shortages, pandemics, reliance on China, and supply chain issues, we need to be more prepared than ever these days. And before disaster strikes, Jace Medical can give you peace of mind so that if there is an emergency, you are not waiting for potentially life-saving medication with many other people in similar situations. Jace Medical is simple. You go online, fill out a form, and then you get prescription life-saving medications right to your door. The Jace case gives you peace of mind so that you are not just hoping that you have access to medication in an emergency. Jace Medical makes sure that you have the medication in hand. Save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using code LOCKEDON at checkout on jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com, promo code locked on. Continuing today's episode of Locked on Wild, once again, thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, make sure you tune in tomorrow as we will be talking with Jack Bushman of Locked on Blackhawks. We'll get a sense of what to expect from Connor Bedard this season. Plus, we'll also talk about what would be considered a good season for Chicago, a team that is trying to claw their way back from the bottom of the Central Division standings. So another Central Division collision is on the way for you on tomorrow's episode of Locked on Wild. Minnesota Wild roster is set as we head into the season. Michael Russo noting that the Wild enter camp with $818,079 in cap space, which means as of right now, Vinny Lettieri, Jujhar Khaira, Nick Swaney, Nick Patan, and Stephen Fogarty are the forwards the Wilds can afford out of camp if they opt to keep 13 forwards. And I saw some reaction yesterday, and so I want to discuss this because we had gone into the season with the hope that we would see some of the young players get more opportunities this season. And now it looks as though the rookies that we're going to see, or young players, not even rookies necessarily, the young players that we're going to see get opportunities this year, likely Marco Rossi, Brock Faber, and Calen Addison. And it's unfortunate because Sammy Walker lit it up in the prospect showcase. We've seen him already be able to play at the NHL speed. Just not a spot for him on this currently constructed roster. And so you hope that his opportunity would potentially come next year. But you look at where he's at with his contract, is that there's going to have to be some resolution to that because he is a restricted free agent after the season is up. I would imagine with what we've seen from him over the last couple of seasons, especially down at the AHL level, and especially with what we saw in limited call-up action last year, I would imagine the Wild will be wanting to keep him around and give him an opportunity to compete for a spot on next year's team, because you have the likes of Ryan Hartman, Matt Zuccarello, Marcus Foligno, Brandon Duhaime, Pat Maroon, all as unrestricted free agents, and Connor Dewar is a restricted free agent after the season. And so there are going to be spots because not all that money is going to be able to bring everybody back. And so then that's where you get into, if player X isn't coming back, then we fill from within with prospect Y. And the hope is that that would be a guy like Sammy Walker for next year. I would rather see the young players get the opportunity as the season progresses, but that has been a staple of Dean Evason during his tenure with the Wild, is that he is more apt to use veterans for these situations. And let's consider the situations too. I'm not defending it, but coaches are coaching for their job at all times. if things go pear-shaped, it's there's potential for them to be fired by whatever regime is currently in place, or if a new regime comes in and says, "Yeah, we'll give you a year to kind of see how it goes," and things don't go well, then they're looking for another job. And so going with veteran experience, they maybe aren't able to give you as high of a ceiling, but you know what you're getting from those guys as opposed to rookies who may come in a little lower but have the potential to really take off. Although even as saying that, we know what Sammy Walker is capable of, and so we'll see what happens. I would imagine if there is a long-term injury situation in which somebody's put on long-term injured reserve to open up additional cap space, that's when we may see one of those guys, whether it be Sammy Walker, whether it be Adam Beckman. That's when we may see them get some opportunities here with this year's team, but it looks as though the young players we're going to see throughout the course of the season are Marco Rossi, Brock Faber, and Calen Addison, at least to start. And beyond that, it depends entirely on how this roster shakes out, who's hurt, who's not. And that appears to just be the way that it is, whether we like it or not. This also means that potential trades during the season are going to be incredibly tough to put together. And so we'll talk about that as well as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Dive into the NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. All you need is a clean, crisp $5 bill, throw it on the Vikings to win the Super Bowl or to just win this weekend against the Chargers, and you can get $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is easy to use, and there is a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. Vikings fans, the Chargers defense has been torched over the first 2 weeks of the season. And so if you're looking for player props from Kirk Cousins, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, I would give those strong consideration as we move closer to the weekend. Make sure you visit fanduel.com/locked on to take advantage of this offer to kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. As we move through the rest of the week, we will get to Marc-Andre Fleury's season preview, as well as talking about the coaching staff and some things that we will need to see from Dean Evison and staff as the season unfolds. So make sure to stay tuned for those as well. And then next week, we will get into some preseason action, and we'll get you set for the start of the regular season, which is closer and closer and closer. October 12th will be here before you know it. Limited funds, eh? Well, that's going to mean that it will be tricky to do anything in season for the Minnesota Wild, depending on how the season goes to start and where they're at in playoff positioning. Brandon Molesky of Beyond the Pod tweeted out yesterday that the fact that the Wild have just over 800,000 in cap space to start the season likely means that it's going to be pretty hard, if not impossible, to complete any sort of a trade during the season. We've seen the Wild over the last 2 seasons bring in healthy amounts of reinforcements. 2 years ago, it was Marc-Andre Fleury. It was Nick Delorier. It was Jake Middleton. Last year, we saw Gustav Nyquist, John Klingberg. We also saw Oscar Sundqvist brought in to help the team and to bolster their reserves. This year, you're probably not going to see that. And this is, I think, the real big indicator of kind of where this team is at and where they will go. If they're hanging around for a playoff spot, then it's going to be this roster that's going to have to kind of will themselves to a postseason spot. But if they are outside the playoff picture looking in as the season unfolds, as we get closer to that trade deadline in March, there's not a move that's going to be able to be done unless there is salary that comes off of the books to make it happen. And depending on where they're at, the more money you intend to acquire, the more money you have to ship out. And so that means that you would have to be able to part with players who are pretty well here, depending on their no movement clause and if they even would be amenable to a trade. Guys that I look at in that particular category include Alex Goligoski, who has the 35 plus no movement clause. He has indicated that he has a strong preference to stay here to finish things out with this contract. But if the season goes pear shaped, will he want to go to a contender to kind of give it one last ride? Marc-Andre Fleury, another. If the season is headed nowhere, is he going to want to go somewhere to try to hop on for a postseason push? The likelihood of those happening is lesser. Those guys have indicated that they want to stay here through the duration of their contract. And so, where does that money then come from if the Wild are going to try to get something done in a trade? John Merrill's making $1.2 million through the 2024-2025 season. But are you going to be able to find something in the $1.2 million range to acquire that is impactful enough if you're outside the postseason picture um, to get back in? And so this is where what I think a lot of people have been wanting to see from this team, this is where this starts to come into play. Because if you don't have any sort of, injection of life to get this team back up the postseason standings, and if they fall and continue to fall further out of it, that's where you start to see moves made to jettison players, jettison veterans to teams that need them for the Stanley Cup playoff push. So, assuming that things don't go well this season, I mean, any of those guys that are unrestricted free agents at the end of the year, Matt Zuccarello, Marcus Foligno, Ryan Hartman, Brandon Duhaime, Pat Maroon, Jujhar Khaira, if he plays well enough to be able to warrant some interest from other teams. Those guys could all be on the table to be moved if the season doesn't go well, and a sell-off is the course of action that makes the most sense for this team. But they're not just going to do that just because. They're not going to throw in the towel unless the race gets that far ahead of them and they're miles out at the trade deadline to where there's not a chance that they can make a comeback in order to get back into postseason contention. So for a lot of people who are frustrated that this team just continues to kind of just be middle and not commit to being bad to get top draft picks, there's a lot that goes into that. We may see this season, if things don't go well, we may see a moderate sell-off to where then there are spots for young players to really attack and earn spots on the roster for next season. And so we just get a little bit more of a kind of definitive timeline as to when some of this stuff could happen. It all depends on how this team does on the ice, because if they do well, then they should be a team that makes the postseason. But if they don't, there's no reinforcements. There's really nothing that can be done to bring in assets to try to help this team out. Now, I won't say it's a 0% or absolutely not, because we've seen Bill Guerin make moves that just kind of came out of nowhere. Ryan Reeves last year And so there may be ways for him to make things happen that, um, for instance, that I have not thought of or anticipated. And so it's not a 0% chance that there are moves made during the course of the season. It's just you pretty much have to move salary off in order to pull anything back on the books as the season plays out. So what you see is most likely what you're going to get as the season rolls forward. So that will do it for today's episode of Locked on Wild. Again, we will finish up the rest of the week with player previews, and then we'll dive into some things to keep an eye on during the preseason. And we'll have a full round of regular season preview content for you as we get closer to the 12th of October. So make sure that you stay tuned so you don't miss out on any new episodes from Locked on Wild as we continue to roll through the rest of the offseason. You can follow us on YouTube. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, and better yet, turn your notifications on so you don't miss out on any new episodes when they drop. Also, follow us on your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes there either. If you are so inclined, make sure you leave us a 5-star review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Helps with the algorithm and getting Locked on Wild better noticed by many other Wild fans like you. We have new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.